He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at any moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out.
So nearly free.
That was the ending to the famous Russian Sleep Experiment short story, posted on August 10th, 2010 by user Orange Soda on their Creepypasta wiki. In it, an experiment is conducted by Soviet researchers on 5 World War II era political prisoners. These prisoners are subjected to an experimental gas stimulant, which prevents them from falling asleep, and their reactions are monitored over a period of 15 days. Predictably, as time passes, the prisoners behave more and more erratically, whispering, screaming, and covering the testing chamber with their own feces, and finally partaking in auto-cannibalism. Just a bad time all around. It's a classic internet spooky tale, probably completely fabricated, but it does touch on some elements of truth. The prevalence of Soviet-era human experimentation, chemically induced insomnia, as well as the strange science of sleep deprivation. Was the author inspired by real-world events, and how close to reality are the consequences of the fictitious experiment? So, is there any truth to the setting itself? The Russians did indeed run experiments on humans during and post-World War II, many of the subjects including political dissidents and foreign agents. Most infamous of these took place in the poison laboratory of the Soviet Secret Services, also known as Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, or Kamera, the Russian word for cell. The Kamera was a clandestine research and development lab, with prisoners being experimented on with various poisons in the aim of developing a tasteless, odorless chemical that could not be detected in the subject after death. The most common method of intake was alongside meals as medicine, but it's not too far-fetched to imagine such experiments administering the poisons in gas form. After all, many of the original leaked KGB documents containing information regarding the laboratory still remain classified to this day. But how long can one stay awake naturally? The longest scientifically documented period was 11 days, set by a 17-year-old Randy Garner in 1965, while numerous other cases of 8 to 10 days have been recorded too. All subjects showed progressive and significant deficits in concentration, motivation, perception, and other higher mental processes as the duration of sleep deprivation increased. We don't have any recorded scientific experiments where humans were forced to stay awake for as long as possible. However, we do have records of its usage in interrogation techniques. In memos signed by the US government, officials claim that forced sleep deprivation was used to keep prisoners awake for up to 180 hours, or 7.5 days, by shackling them to the ceiling, which is less than Randy's record. For longer periods, we will have to turn to animal experiments. In 1894, a Russian scientist and physician named Marie de Manassienne kept puppies perpetually awake through constant activity and noted that they died within a few days. Other similar experiments performed on adult dogs reported figures around 9 to 12 days and 2 weeks, respectively. In all of these experiments, serious degenerative changes were observed in the brains of their subjects. It is worth noting, however, that no human has ever been recorded as dying directly as a result of being kept perpetually awake, and Randy showed no signs of degenerative damage, and in fact was back to normal after a couple nights of recovery sleep. Therefore, it might be possible that humans could be artificially kept awake for longer if incurring lasting damage to the brain was not a concern. Now we move on to the gas itself. Is it possible to administer a chemical that will prevent the subject from sleeping for days at a time? Well, if you've ever drank an energy drink or a cup of coffee, you already know that stimulants such as caffeine can prevent you feeling sleepy for a period of hours at a time, and repeated use can extend that period of wakefulness. With stronger stimulants, the effect can be markedly more pronounced. Drugs like cocaine and amphetamines sometimes see use by long-distance truck drivers who need to stay awake for long periods of time. Amphetamines were even used in World War II on the battlefield, keeping soldiers alert and energized despite prolonged fatigue. However, the human body does have built-in fail-safes to prevent extremely long periods of wakefulness. Short microsleeps occur that can last from a fraction of a second to around 30 seconds, as well as eventual unconsciousness. So, if the gas was in fact a strong chemical stimulant such as crack cocaine or amphetamines, or methamphetamines for that matter, all of which can be inhaled, designed to keep the subject stimulated, what would be the symptoms of prolonged exposure, and how long until the subject's overdosed? Well, in regards to methamphetamine, according to the Recovery Village, a drug and alcohol rehab center in Florida, inhalation is the method that requires the least amount of the substance to display adverse symptoms at 50 milligrams. Inhalation provides a quick burst, but usually lasts only a few minutes, but the overall effect may last longer, depending on the user's tolerance, up to 12 to 14 hours, in fact. High doses of methamphetamine have also reportedly resulted in psychosis and violent outbursts, both of which are definitely demonstrated by prisoners in the tale. Repeated dosage may then be the answer. However, there are a couple of problems with that theory. One example is that one of the several adverse effects of coming down is exhaustion. This would be the opposite of the goal of the researchers, which would be to keep the subject awake. They would then have to constantly redose the prisoners, which brings us to our next issue. Tolerance of methamphetamines can increase rapidly, even after as little as 2 doses, requiring a greater and greater amount to be administered, and in shorter intervals. This would no doubt bring the prisoners closer and closer to the brink of overdosing. There is anecdotal evidence of people with chronic methamphetamine habits staying awake for days or even weeks at a time, but seeing as though these incidents are often self-reported, it's difficult to gauge whether or not these actually happened. Often, those coming off perpetual usage have large gaps in their memory, which could be reference periods of semi-unconsciousness. There also, unsurprisingly, doesn't seem to be any scientific literature regarding keeping people awake for long periods of time with methamphetamine. So the jury is unfortunately out on this aspect of the tale. In conclusion, then, we are left with some interesting facts. There are indeed records of experiments being performed on human subjects during and post World War II, with little regard for their well-being, and various chemicals being administered in an attempt to find a suitable agent for untraceable assassinations. We know that methamphetamines and other stimulants can be inhaled to provide lasting effects, with repeated doses perpetuating the buzz, with caveats, and that there is anecdotal evidence of individuals staying awake for weeks at a time on stimulants. These effects were widely known about, as they were used to keep soldiers awake on the battlefield at the time, which would make research into these effects very attractive for the world powers of the time. We also know that a side effect of such drugs can be violent outbursts, hallucinations, and possible psychosis. Finally, in comparison to the apparent 14 days the subjects were kept awake in the story, we know that individuals have kept themselves awake for up to 11 days and suffered no long-lasting ill effects. Does the combinations of these elements make the Russian sleep experiment plausible? That's for you to decide. Of course, the real horror of the tale comes from the terrible unforeseen consequences and the unholy discovery of the madness that lurks within us all, which only sleep can keep contained. If World War II taught us anything, it's that mankind's capacity for evil is far greater than we can ever imagine. A truth that sleep is an eternal refuge from, even if we inevitably have to wake up.